Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Caitlin Sutton. I'm curator here at the Allport, and I am very excited today to have a speaker here, something a little bit different for us. Firstly, though, I'd like to say Library Tasmania acknowledges the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Luteri to Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of this land, waters and sky. We pay respect to the elders past, present, who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. So Dr. Emerald King, who is with us today, we met just a few weeks ago at the opening of this exhibition, and I was so thrilled to meet her and have a conversation with her. She, a little bit about her background. Dr. Emerald King is lecturer in humanities at the University of Tasmania and is an award-winning cosplayer, cosplay judge and MC. Her research is divided between Japanese women's writing, cosplay as fan translation, and shoujo manga and culture. Since 2017, she has volunteered at the World Cosplay Finals held in Nagoya in August each year as a translator and Japanese-English interpreter. In 2020, she was named a WCS Cosplay Support Ambassador. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Emerald King today. Thank you so much.
What Caitlin is generous enough to not include in how we met is that I stalked her, complimented her on her amazing 80s cocktail frock, and then begged to somehow be included in the dressing up exhibition. Now, I will fully admit that I've got some slides prepared, I've got a talk prepared. I might have to move the microphone because I'm ridiculously tall. But I'm not quite sure where we'll end up or how we'll get there. So we may end up having a chat if there are any burning questions online or in the room, or I talk too quickly, or there's something that I don't really explain well enough. It's a nice informal-ish gathering, so please don't be afraid to fling a hand up or tell me to take a deep breath and slow down. So this talk in many ways is about the history of cosplay, focusing on Australia, but also on Tasmania. And I'm trying very hard not to talk about my own cosplay experience, but of course, I realised in going through photos that I'm actually a part of the history of cosplay in Tasmania, which is really weird to me because I'm a literature person and usually I don't have anything to do with people or histories or anthropologies. I look at books and I read clothes as texts and we have a lovely time unpicking and unthreading metaphors. But cosplay in Tasmania actually starts in the Allport Museum with the 2008 Go Graphic exhibition. And these are the only 3 photos that I can find from that time, including the amazing green carpet that used to be out in the front foyer as well as in this room. So it's nice to have a living memory. So I think what I'll do is I'll give a very brief general rundown of cosplay in general, kind of a world history, and then narrow it down to Australia. And then what I'd like to finish on is talking through the process of what cosplay is and how we actually create a costume. And I will say that the definition that I use for cosplay is incredibly narrow because I work a lot on cosplay competitions. There we go. So for me and my incredibly narrow definition of cosplay, it's one that was actually the most common definition in the late 90s and early 2000s when cosplay spread to Australia. And that is an anime or a manga, Japanese game, or tokusatsu. So tokusatsu are like your Power Rangers, that kind of, it's called a special recording technique. So Godzilla is tokusatsu. So that for me is what cosplay is. It's dressing up as those anime manga characters. That is an obsolete definition and I get to use it because I'm a crusty academic. Nowadays, cosplay has become far more widespread, and it's often used just to mean fancy dress or dress-ups. And I'm really surprised more and more to see it cropping up in even political discourse. I read a report from the US exit from Iraq where they were talking about how the soldiers were cosplaying over there as an invading or as some kind of force. Which just absolutely blew my mind that this word that for me is about pretty dresses, which those of you in the room can see. And you can see on screen an image from 2014 from our New Zealand cousins, can be used in this quite political, quite fraught area. So it spreads out of Japan in the late 1990s as anime becomes more popular and accessible. And there is actually a lot of conjecture as to where this term actually comes from, with a long-held debate that it's a US term and then it comes from Star Trek because everything begins with Star Trek. And there is some fact to that. So in 1984, the most widely accepted narrative of where this word comes from was that in 1984, a mangaka from Studio Hard called Nob Takahashi goes to the US, sees Star Trek cosplayers, decides to write about it, but putting things into Japanese, putting the words into Japanese that were commonly used in the States at the time, like costuming or masquerade, it's really hard. If you put that into a Japanese pronunciation, it turns into masquerade or costume pure or costuming. The other thing that does is it takes up a lot of printing space because you need to print out each syllable as opposed to where you're using a Sino-Japanese word where you can say a lot with one character. So it becomes expensive in the 80s to have long words that you're printing. And so he coins this term cosplay. But really interestingly, there's some like hot off the press cosplay research that came out last year from Ed Hoff, who is a Canadian living in Japan and actually is one of the organizers of the World Cosplay Summit, where he's found evidence that cosplay actually predates this 1984 date that it was being used and spoken about in the very, very late 70s, which is exciting. And that's what I love about research, is that everything changes. But of course, humans really like dressing up. So you'll see here that I have some very cheeky comparisons between some, we've got some Lautrec, we've got some Monet, we've got some Van Gogh, which happens as Japan opens up in the late 1880s and as we have the first wave of Japanophile, or a kind of Japanese soft power boom. And here we have some of the more famous images. I particularly like the one of Toulouse-Lautrec dressed up as a Meiji emperor with his little dolly. I think that's wonderful. And the interesting thing about those kind of Japanese dolls is there's a very random roundabout link, again, linking everything back to Tasmania, because these dolls were sold in Hobart, and I know that because after Hobart flooded, in the early 60s, my grandmother bought my mum one as a present because it was flood soiled, so they could afford to buy it. But it wasn't sold as a Japanese doll because World War II had just happened. So for years we had this doll and we didn't know what it was. And then I did a degree, and now I have a beautiful dolly just like Toulouse-Lautrec. So, of course, as things shift and move, meanings slide. And a really great example of this is the confusion between street fashion and cosplay. And again, back to my really almost obsolete definition, where I'm looking purely at costumes, usually at costumes that have been created for the purpose of competitions. And I just want to go out and kind of spread the gospel that just because people are wearing clothes that look different doesn't mean that they're necessarily in cosplay, which apparently a lot of my colleagues in cosplay studies, it is still an emerging area. We're yet to discover our kind of core text. I'm hoping that one of my pieces will become a core text. But there is a lot of confusion as to where the line between cosplay and dress-ups and street fashion happens. And one site that we see this is with a lot of the Harajuku fashions or Lolita fashions. Basically, there are lots of things that look the same, but they're not always the same. And I think evolution has a really great example for us here, because if you look at all the things that look like crabs aren't necessarily crabs, but there's this great scientific theory that basically when evolution gets stuck, it makes a crab. So look that one up. It's fascinating. So as I said, I work mostly on cosplay competitions. Cosplay competitions are held at conventions, and what we have happening at conventions is we have the beginning of geek or nerd culture. So the very, very first sci-fi convention, as we would recognize it, is held in the 1930s. That's where we have the first Spanish dressing up. There's a documentary on SBS at the moment, which I wouldn't want to say is wrong, but perhaps misguided when they say that the first costume was made by 4E and that he was accompanied by the great Morojo. And I just want to say that Morojo, who was his girlfriend at the time, made all of their costumes and didn't get any credit. 4E took it all, and then she dumped him, and then she went on and lived a much happier life and made lots more costumes. That was in the 30s and 40s. So even though we have this grand tradition of dressing up, Spanish dressing up, as we know what to do with sci-fi, starts in the 1930s with sci-fi conventions, and then eventually we have anime spreading and anime cropping up at different conventions. And as these conventions grow, the way that they are, I want to say almost performed. Like you go, even as an everyday attendant, you go to the event and you perform the act of being an exhibition or an expo attendee, whether that's dressing in cosplay, whether that's wearing a fan t-shirt, whether that's lining up for 3 hours to get a signature from your most favourite movie star or voice actor or artist or author, whether that's wearing pins or badges. So, you know, there's a very performative act. You go to a thing, you're seen doing the thing. And so in Australia, an example, one of the great hilarities of going to an exhibition is starts as you get there. So whenever there's a big event in Melbourne, you'll often see that the trams, as you get closer to the exhibition space, are filled with cosplayers. Often the police will have a memo going around to say, please don't carry your sci-fi guns in public and cause a panic. And then every year, undoubtedly, there will be a Marvel Deadpool character who will be picked up from a train platform for having all of their fake guns and knives on display. Tradition. What's life without them? But this is in stark difference to what we see happening at Japanese events, where there's this idea that you can't cause offense to those around you, and so cosplayers will often get changed once they get to the event. This has become so developed to the point where there are actually these really special suitcases that you can buy, and they'll have like a hook that comes out that you can hang your costume on, and there'll be like a side mirror that comes out, and it will all just kind of telegraph out so that you have a little changing room, and then you can pack it all away, have your photos taken, and then get changed, and then hop on the train home. And it sounds really great and almost futuristic, but it really reminds me of things like Victorian bathing machines, where like you put on your costume in the bathing machine, you were taken out into the water, you enjoyed the water, and you climb back into your bathing machine, and then you were taken, and you know, so there's these different levels of propriety and what's accepted. So in Japan, that's part of this. So I got ahead of myself, but I did want to show you this amazing photo, which it's quite old now, And there have been some rules introduced to protect cosplayers from these walls of photographers. Most events in Japan will now have a no lower angle shot rule, because otherwise there was quite a market in non-consensual upskirt photos. And the photos from that time were quite incredible, where instead of this wall of photographers standing around, it was a wall of photographers sitting with their cameras in their lap, standing erect at the correct angle. We also have differences in how cosplay is done. So for a lot of the time, and I would say up until the pandemic, when everything changed, there was a huge emphasis on US and Australian and kind of Anglophone countries, where it was about looking the part and then having photos with your friend, and then maybe doing something silly like going to McDonald's or going to the pub, or, you know, this kind of creating some kind of anachronism between the expected world of anime and the exhibition, and then going out into the real world, where this would never happen in Japan. It makes no sense. But what does happen is there's been quite a boom in photo studios, where people will go and rent out a photo studio and have their photos taken there. And so there's much more emphasis on embodying the character and posing for photos. And because of this and because of the demand for content, there's much less of a taboo on purchase costumes. And interestingly, the younger generation of cosplayers, of which I'm not a part, have a really interesting TikTok culture, where they're making videos, they're doing TikTok dances, and a lot of that is in purchase costumes because of the speed and the desire for new content. And so there's a movement in cosplay at the moment where we're thinking about how we can do things more equitably with a view to reusing costumes or rewearing costumes. So there's a lot of crossover between things like fast fashion and fast cosplay. In line with my very obsolete definition, this is a great article from 2009, which I'm sure one day I'll meet the author and they'll yell at me because she's lovely, and they'll yell at me for continuing to drag this quote out, but I think it's great. With this cosplay's main attraction lies in its Japaneseness. Cosplay provides new avenues for fans to express their interest in Japanese popular culture creatively. But that is definitely no longer the case in 2023, year 4 of the pandemic. We're seeing, as I said, cosplay being used as a term that's very much gone out of this creative dress-up space, and we're also seeing much more than just Japanese products being cosplayed. And I find it really interesting that while it is still a link to Japan for a lot of people, particularly if we're looking at things like the World Cosplay Summit, which I don't think I've spoken about apart from in the introduction that Caitlin gave me. So the World Cosplay Summit started in 2003 partly by Ed Hoff, who I mentioned earlier, and executives from a television corporation in Nagoya. It's been running ever since then as kind of like, I used to describe it as the Nerd Olympics, where it brought all these different teams from around the world together for an event that's 10 days. This year there's only 5 days because we're still kind of trying to find our feet, but usually about 5 to 10 days, culminating in a performance championship. But before then, you've got government visits, you've got tourism visits, you've got industry visits. So Brother is one of the sponsors, so it's quite often that there'll be a trip to the Brother factory to play with all the new sewing machines and tools, which is quite fun. I enjoy that, but apparently talking to other organisers who've been going for many more years than me, it gets a bit boring after the 10th time. I really hope that I get to go the 10 times to find out how boring it gets. But I was talking the other day with somebody and I realised that it's not the Olympics, it's Eurovision. All right, there are prelims and heats to get there. Winning the right to go and represent your country at the World Cosplay Summit is the prize, and then anything else is extra. And it was really interesting during the pandemic to see these teams helping each other out even after the event had happened. If we look at things like the Chilean uprising that was happening at that time, if we look at what's happening in Myanmar at that time, a lot of cosplayers knew about it because they'd met at the World Cosplay Summit and they could discuss things and contact each other through those networks. So I guess in the same way that cosplay as a term is slipping out of its original usage, these connections that are being made through the World Cosplay Summit are also far more reaching than you'd think from make a 2-minute and 30-second skit about an anime or a manga and go to Japan. So I want to kind of jump around a bit and talk about how costumes are created, but I do want to also touch on this very important issue of consent in cosplay. So the Cosplay is Not Consent movement started around 2013, and there was some pushback from people who were used to going to anime, manga, and popular culture events, seeing their favorite character brought to life perfectly by these amazingly gorgeous cosplayers, and being able to take a photo with them and being able to touch them. And you can see that it's very easy for these things to get out of hand, and apparently they often would. And so this movement was born, and it was picked up, and you'll see it nearly every pop culture event now. There will be large banners saying cosplay is not consent. Make sure you get permission. Don't take photos of people when they're eating or changing, or all these things that outside of the event space, to me, seem really obvious. But within this moment, it's almost a carnivalesque loosening of everyday rules. So I find it interesting to see where this movement will go as we return to events, where there's not this kind of social distancing, and whether it becomes more than just a slogan. So that's cosplay in a nutshell. Before I move on to talk about how to cosplay in 10-ish easy steps, are there any questions from online or in the room? Not yet. Not yet. All right, wonderful. There will probably definitely be time for questions at the end, but I'm more than happy to wax lyrical about these things. So what I'd like to do for those of you online, I'm sorry you can't see this, but I will hold things up as they become relevant. But in the room, you'll see that there is a rather janky looking weapon on the table next to me and a red jacket. And some of you might be familiar with that jacket. Some of you may not have even noticed it because it's next to a rather fabulous pink gown. And that's fine, because I'm very proud of that pink gown. And I'm amazed with the lighting in here, because all of my gems are just glistening, and it's amazing to look at it and see it in literally a new light and be like, yeah, that deserved to win the prize that it won when I made it back in the day as Dresserly from writing my PhD. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to count us through 10-ish easy steps to make a costume. So this is the Canada outfit and bike and heavy, I can't remember the name of the gun. It's like a heavy something or other laser cannon with lots of numbers, and to which I say I'm a literature person, not a number person. But this was made for the 2019 heats of the Australian World Cosplay Summit preliminaries. We came second, which is still kind of amazing because we're basically wearing t-shirts and jeans. And we were up against fabulous teams and like flowing silk martial arts robes and massive ball gowns. We did have a bike though. So Akira comes out in, it's a long-running manga series published in the 80s and 90s. It comes out as a film in the late 80s. It is groundbreaking. It changes the way that anime is made. There are no fewer than, I think it's, I'm going to get no fewer than, again numbers, 3 red pigments that are created just for this film to get the right colours for particularly Kaneda's outfit and also his bike. It's a tale about it starts off in Neo-Tokyo, just before the 2020 Neo-Tokyo Olympics are about to happen. There is a global pandemic. And against this background, we have this group of bikers. One of whom finds out has some kind of psychic powers. He has a meltdown, and it just ends with Tokyo exploding again. We performed this in July 2019, which is actually when the film is set. So I'm sorry. The hilarious thing is, I was watching the skit of it last night, and before you go on stage in the World Cosplay Summit and in any of the World Cosplay Summit preliminaries, there's a little video that's shown where you introduce yourself. And at that time, I had completely lost my voice. I couldn't speak. So I had a piece of cardboard. While my partner introduced us, I held up this piece of cardboard, which I'd written on it in texter, "I have plague, don't beat me," which, hindsight, did we cause the pandemic? No. Is there some kind of correlation? Did Akira predict 2020? Who knows? There are lots of internet and Reddit forums about whether it's true or not, and definitely during the protests that were happening outside of the Tokyo Olympic venues, a lot of the motifs and the graffiti from this film were used as part of the protest. So it's a not insignificant anime to take on, which in itself was quite daunting. So step 1, be foolish and pick one of the most popular and influential anime of all time to make characters from, and find source images. Step 2 is to plan what you're going to make and create diagrams. Now, I'm very lucky that when they were filming the anime, they actually had to come up with all of the specs for the bike. And so there are people who've actually used these specs to make a working model of the bike. The bike is about 3 meters long. The prop limit for stage props is 2 meters. So I had to make my own measurements to have a 2 meter long bike. So first, step 1, pick your costume. Step 2, plan. And then step 3 is kind of figure out how you're going to do everything. Make a list of what needs to be done, starting and figure out what order everything needs to be made. Step 4 is material selection and collection. And I will quite happily say that the entire thing is made out of junk. So that first image on that screen there is the shopping trolley of vacuum cleaner parts, pool noodles. There's some washing machine hose in there, and then a whole bag of knobs, and a huge bag of computer cords that we went up to the Hobart tip shop and picked up. And luckily was talking to somebody who knew Akira and was a fan and gave us a huge discount on my shopping trolley of junk. So this is where we started material selection, and I've got here soft versus hard because everything is going to be a mix of, even the fabulous ball gown that those in the room can see, there's considerations there for how do you create these shapes. The ball gown in particular comes from this really intricate design where all of the skirts float up in this really delicate curlers that I had never seen created in a way that to my mind was satisfactory. And I forgot to pack the petticoats, so it's not quite as floofy as it should be. But if you look at it, you'll see that the edge of the gown is almost wired. It's got a very stiff boning plastic in the hems, which means that it kind of kicks up and floofs around, a la ballroom dancing of the Baz Luhrmann Strictly Ballroom era. Completely out of style now. Nobody would be seen dead wearing the kind of stuff that we see in Strictly Ballroom, but ballroom dancing research led me to come up with that hard plastic for the correct skirts. When we were picking out things for Akira, we used a lot of rubbish. And then for my outfit, I realized that he wears red denim jeans and a red leather jacket. Red denim is really hard to get. I ended up sourcing it from the UK, which is like, well, there goes all of my efforts to not have a footprint in this costume. But yeah, so step 4, material choices, and then we can start making. Usually we're thinking about foundation garments as the first step, particularly if you're going to change your body type. I am a not very small, very curvaceous woman, trying to dress up as a 17-year-old boy. So those kind of things need to be taken into consideration when you are cross-dressing, just as much as when you are dressing as in a big ball gown, or again, those in the room, if you look at the gold costume, you can see that there is a not too insubstantial breastplate there. Feel free to come up later on and knock on it and feel how hard that thing is, because it's solid. But you know, in order to create that, to get those characters' curves, you need to think about what you're going to add to your body, what you're going to take away from your body, what's going to be comfortable, and where you can distribute and stash all of those lumps, bumps, protrusions while you're wearing the costume. And then we go into patterning. So here you can see my delightful, very attractive mock-up for the jacket, and then the jacket that I made as a practice run, and then decided to spend 100 hours doing gold work on, because why not? And then that's the very important pocket placement on my denim jeans. Again, thinking about creating the right shape, it was really important to me to get the pockets in a way that made my very peachy bottom a bit flatter. It's a little bit flatter. And I'll hold up the jacket so you can see what it looked like. So I do have finished photos of this, but you can see that it kind of goes from that very stunning mustard and blue satin to that. Am I in frame? How am I going? Cool.
Yeah.
And speaking of material choice, well, I've got this here. This is very serious, very, 18-year-old man jacket. But there's this scene in Akira which still gives me nightmares, where our antagonist, I guess, kind of discovers his powers and is put away in a shady government facility. And inside the shady government facility, there is a nursery, and we have 3 other figures who also have these magical, mental powers, almost seeming magical. And it kind of turns into this nightmare where giant teddy bears come alive, and there's a rocking horse and giant milk bottles that spew milk everywhere, and just, I don't know why, but for some reason the image of the milk bottles erupting everywhere, it makes me feel ill, and that's usually where I'll pause and then come back to it. But I found this fabric. So that's my homage to the thing in the dystopian anime that I found most disturbing, which is the pretty nursery scene. I did not get extra marks for my fancy lining. So I've got here Step 7, big pieces, time size versus comfort goals. And you might think that when I'm talking about comfort goals here, that it would be the little embroidery was the thing that was comforting for me to do. But actually, I like building props. I like making things out of cardboard. So the comfort here for me was making that rifle. This is what I've, for those of you online, this is what I've got in the room with me. It is made from vacuum cleaner parts. There's some broken calculators in there. There's the back of a washing machine in there. That's where my bag of knobs ended up. And I think there's about 3 different post tubes in there. Oh, and a rice bowl. Oh man, the rice bowl is very important. That was fine. That was a joy to make. I had no problems. I just got all the junk. Somehow my hands knew what they were doing, and then magically, presto, laser. The embroidery, because I can't satin stitch with a damn. So this pill on this jacket is the most iconic point of the costume. It is the most trouble I've ever had making a thing in any costume I've ever made. And I'm still not happy with it. But I bring this up because it's a point where you need to give yourself a break. A lot of these costumes are builds that will be from several months to several years, and you need to be able to sustain your enthusiasm in creating these garment sets, welds. So for me, getting to make the laser was a real treat, and in fact that's what I made first before I started building anything else. And then I avoided doing the embroidery for as long as possible, but I also knew that it was really important to get that right because it is so iconic, to the point where if you're on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok and you look up like Akira moving GIF, just the pill comes up to signify the entire film. So I knew I had to get that right. So along the way, you need to pace yourself and give yourself little treats. And then we have sewing all of the things. So there you can see the jacket without its fastenings. As I said, we wore t-shirts and jeans, so of course we had to make our own t-shirts. We then had great fun covering them in coffee so that they look like really grotty boy t-shirts. And you'll be pleased to know, if you've ever lived in a house with an 18-year-old man, that before we went on stage, we had a can of Lynx each and just doused each other so that we could smell the part. And then I've got the picture of the glove up there, and it's very hard to see, but I wanted a realness from motorcycles. I grew up around motorcycles. My father and my older brother ride, and so I wanted to make sure that I had knuckle protectors and hard knees in my jeans. Unfortunately, I'm very bad apparently at making knuckle protectors and hard jeans, because when I took the costume off, I had bruises all over my knees and scraped knuckles from the garment that I had made to protect myself. It may have also been, though, because I was crawling around on the dirt a lot, being like, look, I've got knee pads on, and look, I can punch things because I've got knuckle protectors. So, bad design, silly things that were done. I blame the Lynx haze. And then step 10 is creating the props. Now, there are 2 main types of cosplay competitions globally. One is a kind of everybody can enter, let's look at your costume, where you walk on, walk off. It's quite a joyous occasion. And then we have the big money prize competitions. And that could be something like winning a trip to Japan to represent your country, or it can be winning a purse. The C2E2 Crown Champions of Cosplay was just held in Chicago on the weekend, and I think that has a prize pool of thousands and thousands of US dollars. Separating those big purse competitions, you either have a skit competition or you have a walk-on with no skit. So if you're going in a walk-on where there's no skit, You finish your costume, it's fantastic. You stand on stage, you do some poses, you look pretty, you win a prize, happy days. If you're going in a skit competition, you need to think about the skit. And really, I've got it here, props research and more search images at number 9, but you need to be thinking about the skit from the very beginning. You could come up with the most fabulous, beautiful garment, but if you can't move it on stage, what are you going to do for a skit? So for this one, we knew that we wanted to have the bike. There is a moment in Akira where Kaneda does a bike swerve. It is one of the most copied pieces of animation. There's a Bart Simpson version, there's a Barbie version, there's a Hello Kitty version. If it's an animated character, they have been animated doing this bike swerve. So we knew that we wanted that in the skit. We knew that the antagonist grows this really gross mutated arm before he mutates and explodes. We knew we wanted the gross arm to happen. And so those were the two things that we had to get: bike swerve, gross arm. So in order to get the bike, in order to have the bike swerve, we needed to make the bike. So that is built on a computer chair that I took from Melbourne to Sydney and then built in our hotel room in 2 parts. Borrowed a trolley from a bakery near the hotel to carry the front half, which doesn't have wheels, wheeled the back half over to the convention centre, and then stuck it all together with gaffer tape and prayers backstage, and it held apart on stage. That's the important thing. Held apart on stage. And then we installed lights and did all sorts of fancy things, but essentially that is like the cheapest fantastic furniture rolly chair that you can get, and it needed to be a new chair so that I could not build the whole thing, so that it could be the right specs. What else is on there? Some cardboard that I picked up from the side of the road in Melbourne, some really cheap Bunnings push lights, some salad bowls. Yeah, junk. And then the last step is finishing touches, wig makeup and contacts. And you can see there me trying to get the shape of the wig fresh out of the bag. It's amazing what you can do just with finger combing. I ended up cutting that short though to get that really attractive Lego Man helmet that Kaneda rocks. And then my partner Amy there, we that black wig that she's wearing, the black spiky wig, we bought on sale, and it was actually the lovely greeny beige colour of the carpets in here. And so that was achieved through, I coloured in the hairline with texture, and then I got bored of that, so I got a can of black spray paint and spray painted the rest of it, which is great because that hair will also not move. So that's it. That is how to cosplay in 10-ish easy steps. And then if everything goes to plan, you end up with something that looks like this. Okay. If you can hear the sound, you hear a powerful engine. So that's pretty much all that pretty much where I wanted to end up going. I might put that onto something a bit less apocalyptic. Let's go back to the start. Sorry, for anybody who is viewing, that's very painful to watch. Yeah, that's my ramble ended thing. Questions? Yes.
So that little bit that you were doing at the end.
Yes.
Is that what you call a skit, or was it a skit?
Yes.
So otherwise, it just sort of walked on in your costume and turned around. Yeah. Right.
Yep. Yeah. So the World Cosplay Summit rules call for a 2-minute and 30-second skit. It's really interesting. Again, the difference between various sites of cosplay in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, these performances are really big business, and of course they are all checked by the CCP before they're performed, and they go up for 20 minutes and have casts of hundreds. Not only the performers on stage, but also the technicians, the garment makers, and there's quite a belief in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong that why would you bother making your own costume when there are so many artisans and factories that you can buy things from? So there have been a couple of years where it's been quite difficult to get competitors for the World Cosplay Summit from China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And also, I think it's really cool that for the World Cosplay Summit, at least at the moment, they do have 3 teams from the Chinese region of Hong Kong and Taiwan, as well as mainland China. Yeah.
Sound effects?
Yes. As the sound isn't sharing, but so with the skit, you have a full sound effects, backgrounds, voice acting. My partner Amy, my cosplay partner Amy, is a sound technician. So she made sure that the audio was really good, and when the gross arm mutated, she had the most disgusting kind of meat squelching, popping sounds, and she also used brown noise throughout that as well. Brown noise is a frequency that makes humans uncomfortable and can cause brown noises in other body parts. So she added in these little layers of tricks. So even though it's 2 minutes 30, you're going to work on this thing for a year, be on stage for a second, full production values.
How big is the cosplay community in Tasmania?
That's a really good question. So I discovered it in I discovered the cosplay community discovered me in 2007 when I first started my PhD, and I was asked to give a talk at the then anime society of then anime event called Icon, Anime Island Convention. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to give a talk on magical girls, which is what my topic was, then I should dress as a magical girl. And that's how I discovered it, and I was quite involved in the society up until I got my first job, which was in New Zealand, and then I would come back to judge and MC every year. It kind of went on a lull. Icon was one of the longest running, when it finished, it was one of the longest running events in Australia. It lasted for, is it 12 years that it lasted for? Which is quite long. Most conventions in the early days came out of university clubs and societies. A lot of them now are big corporates with American parents. And so you can imagine that it's quite hard to kind of balance that university club and society versus these powerhouses. So there was a bit of a lull. The pandemic certainly didn't help the scene down here. But we did have our first TasPop convention at the end of last year. So that's TasPop South. There's one in Launceston next month. And I run a cosplay photography event, a cosplay photography festival. We ran it as a pilot last year, and we had 30 photographers and cosplayers show up from not only Tasmania, a lot of people came down from Launceston from it. So I think at the moment the scene is a little bit stronger in Launceston than it is down south. But we had people come down from Adelaide, Melbourne, and over from Auckland as well. So it's small but vibrant. And I think as things progress and we kind of learn how to deal with public events and being out in public and kind of get that confidence back again, I think that things are only going to grow.
Is the idea of cosplay that you're always relating it back to some actual cultural character, or can you be a more generic?
That is a brilliant question, and again, it goes to the way that cosplay is done differently in different countries. In Australia, for the longest time, I said it was Japanese based. That's not the case anymore. In Japan, of course, everything is Japanese based. In the United States, there's quite a long tradition of doing OCs, or original character cosplay, which was a little bit more frowned upon in Australia, but I'm not quite sure where that lies at the moment, particularly if you look at the popularity of things like Critical Role, a tabletop role-playing game, which has a huge YouTube following, and then people are dressing up as those original characters, which I'm not quite sure where that lies. So it could be that the Australian scene is changing again as to what's popular and what's not.
And is there a continuum moving in from cosplay to theatre?
There can be. It's amazing how many of the people who I've been cosplaying with for years are now in costume shops in theatres or state ballets. When I was in New Zealand, it was great because a lot of my friends were working or contracting to Weta, to the point where my then employer was like, we're going to do a university course combined with Weta. And I heard that and got invited along just like some random. It's a Weta workshop, so the company behind Lord of the Rings and Weta Digital and all those really, like, if it's big and special and comes out of New Zealand, Weta have had something to do with it, usually. So the university that I worked for in New Zealand decided that they were going to do a combined course with the Weta people, and I got invited along as, I think, to make up numbers. But when we were doing the tour, there are all these people working, and we did the special tour, like not the tour that the tourists get, the tour that the people who need to be impressed get. So we're going through all the different workshops, and I just kept on running into people and running off from the tour to go hug them and catch up. And so by the end of that, we had a meeting about how the course was going to run. And one of the Weta guys and I sat down in a corner, half an hour, wrote an entire course. Everybody else was still like doing the hobnobbing thing, and we were like, right, done, let's get this out there. And then I got a job in Australia, and that course never happened. And I'd like to think it was just because it wasn't the right university for it, but who knows, maybe the mix of people weren't right. But yes, to answer your question, there is a lot of crossover between cosplay and then going into costuming industries. And also the other way around, there are some performers who discover that there are other ways for them to dress up. So there are no more questions. I think that's time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking